I never thought at 65 I'd be making decisions that would change everything. Sunday brunch with my 3 children had become our monthly ritual, gathering around the same oak table where I'd served them breakfast for decades. The coastal Oregon rain drummed against the windows of our family home as I watched Soren check his phone, Talia adjust her yoga mat bag, and Marin organize everyone's coffee cups with the same careful attention she'd shown since childhood. They were good children, grown now into their own complicated lives. But as I looked at them that morning, I realized they saw me as predictable, safe, unchanging. "I have a secret," I said quietly, testing the words. They laughed, the sound echoing off the cedar walls like it always had. Soren barely looked up from his screen. But what would they say when they learned I'd rewritten my will to leave everything to someone they'd never heard of? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the salt-stained windows of my cedar wood home, casting familiar shadows across the hardwood floors that Eli and I had refinished together 30 years ago. I moved through my morning routine with the precision of someone who had learned to find comfort in small rituals. Coffee first, always in the blue ceramic mug Marin had made in her high school pottery class. Then I'd sit in Eli's old chair by the window, watching the Oregon coast reveal itself through the lifting fog. The house felt too large some days, filled with the echoes of a family that had grown up and moved on. But it was mine now, truly mine for the first time since I'd married Eli 43 years ago. He'd been gone 10 years, long enough for the sharp edges of grief to wear smooth, leaving behind something that felt more like acceptance than loss. I pulled out the hidden photo album from behind my collection of first editions, the one my children had never seen. Page after page of faces looked back at me, 17 foster children who had passed through these rooms over 8 years in my 30s. Their names were written in my careful librarian's script beneath each photo. Marcus, age 6, stayed 3 months. Sarah, age 12, 2 weeks. And then, near the end, Genevieve, age 9, for months. Jenny's face smiled up at me from the photograph, gap-toothed and hopeful, her dark hair braided with the yellow ribbon I'd bought her at the farmer's market. She'd been different from the others, not just in the length of her stay, but in the way she'd settled into our family's rhythm. While Soren, Talia, and Marin had initially resented sharing their space, Jenny had found ways to make herself indispensable. She'd helped me organize the spice rack, memorized everyone's favorite breakfast, and spent hours in the library corner I'd created, reading everything she could reach. The front door chimed, and I quickly closed the album. Marin's voice carried through the house with its familiar warmth. "Mum? I brought bagels from that place you like." My youngest daughter appeared in the kitchen doorway, her teacher's bag slung over one shoulder and a paper bag in her hand. At 34, she still moved through my house like she belonged here, opening cabinets and arranging items with an unconscious knowledge of where everything lived. Of my 3 children, she was the one who'd stay closest, both geographically and emotionally. "You're early," I said, accepting her kiss on my cheek. "Soren and Talia won't be here for another hour. I wanted to help you set up. And I thought we could talk before the chaos starts." She pulled out plates and began slicing the bagels with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding groups. "You seem ... I don't know, different last week, distracted." I watched her work, noting the careful way she avoided meeting my eyes. Marin had always been perceptive, the child who noticed when someone was upset before they'd said a word. It was what made her such a good teacher. But it also meant she carried the weight of other people's emotions more than was healthy. Different how? I asked, though I knew what she meant. The decision I'd made 6 months ago had changed something fundamentally me, like finally letting out a breath I'd been holding for decades. "I don't know." Lighter, maybe? "Like you've made some kind of decision?" She turned to face me, her expression curious rather than worried. "It's not a bad different. Just ... noticeable." Before I could respond, Soren's car pulled into the driveway. With its familiar rumble, my eldest son drove a Tesla now, sleek and silent except for the crunch of gravel under its tires. Through the window, I watched him check his phone one more time before getting out. his movements sharp and efficient, even on a Sunday morning. "The king arrives," Marin murmured. But without real malice, she'd long ago made peace with Soren's driven personality. Even if she didn't always understand it, Soren entered without knocking, his presence immediately changing the energy in the room. At 42, he'd inherited his father's height and his grandfather's intensity, but none of Eli's wandering spirit. Where his father had been content to chase historical mysteries across the country, Soren had built his life around control and accumulation. "Morning, Mom," he kissed my forehead absently, already scanning the kitchen as if cataloguing its contents. "Coffee smells good. Is Talia coming?" "She be here," I said, though with Talia, punctuality was more suggestion than promise. "How's Rachel, the kids?" "Fine. Busy. Emma starts high school in the fall. Can you believe that?" He accepted the coffee Marin handed him and immediately pulled out his phone. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last month. About maybe updating some of the financial arrangements. Making sure everything's properly structured for tax efficiency." I felt something tighten in my chest. Soren had been circling the topic of my estate planning for months, always couched in terms of helping me organize my affairs. He meant well. I knew that. But his assumption that my financial life needed his management stung more than I'd expected. "We can talk about that later," I said, noting how Marin's shoulders tensed at the mention of money. My children's relationship with inheritance was complicated, tied up in guilt and expectation in ways that made me sad. Talia's arrival was announced by the slam of her car door and the jangle of what sounded like 47 pieces of jewelry. She burst through the front door like a force of nature, her greying curls barely contained by a colourful headband, yoga mat under one arm and an enormous canvas bag over the other. Sorry, I know I'm late. I got caught up talking to this amazing woman at the farmer's market who's starting a meditation retreat for women over 50. And you know how I get when someone starts talking about finding your authentic self." She dropped her bags and wrapped me in a hug that smelled like patchouli and sea air. "Mom, you look fantastic. Are you using a new moisturizer?" This was vintage Talia, scattered, enthusiastic, and somehow managing to make everyone smile despite her chaos. She hugged Marin and ruffled Soren's hair, ignoring his grimace as she settled into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "So," she said, spreading cream cheese on a bagel with artistic swoops, "what's new in the Svoral family universe? Anyone have exciting news? Life updates? Existential revelations?" I looked around the table at my 3 children, each so different from the others, each carrying their own version of our family story. Soren, methodical and protective, believing that love was expressed through planning and provision. Talia, searching for meaning in every interaction, sometimes exhausting herself with the effort of staying positive. Marin, quietly observant, often sacrificing her own needs to keep everyone else comfortable. They were good people, raised with love and attention. But somewhere along the way, I'd become supporting cast in my own life, defined entirely by my role as their mother and Eli's wife. When had I stopped being Kale and become simply Mom? "Actually," I said, setting down my coffee cup with more force than necessary, "I do have something to tell you. I've made some changes, some decisions about the future." Soren looked up from his phone, his lawyer instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of decisions?" "The kind that might surprise you." Talia clapped her hands together. "Oh, I love surprises. Are you taking that painting class you mentioned? Or maybe you're dating?" Someone, as she paused, struck by a new thought. "Please tell me you're not moving to one of those senior communities. Because honestly, Mom, you're way too interesting for shuffleboard and group dinners at 4:30. I laughed despite my nervousness. "Nothing quite so dramatic, but ... Well, let's just say I've been doing some thinking about what really matters. About legacy and what it means to leave something behind." Marin leaned forward, her teacher's intuition picking up on undercurrents the others missed. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" "Health-wise, I mean, I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I know exactly what I'm doing." The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than a simple statement about week and plans or household decisions. I could see my children processing, trying to decode what I meant, what changes might be coming to disrupt the comfortable patterns we'd all settled into. What they couldn't know was that everything had already changed 6 months ago when I'd walked into Cameron Doyle's law office and asked him to rewrite my will. I'd felt something unlock inside me that had been closed for decades. The decision hadn't been impulsive or emotional, it had been the most rational thing I'd done in years. But explaining that to my children, helping them understand that love doesn't always look like financial inheritance, that sometimes the people who need us most aren't the ones related by blood, that conversation would require more courage than I'd needed for anything since Eli's diagnosis. I looked at each of their faces, memorizing this moment before everything changed. Tomorrow, when Cameron called them into his office to read the will, they would learn that nearly everything I owned was going to a 17-year-old girl they'd never heard of. They would be hurt, confused, angry. They would question my mental state, my judgment, my love for them. But today, for just a few more hours, we were still the family they thought we were. Today, I could still be the predictable, safe mother they'd always known. The secret I carried felt heavy and light at the same time, like holding something precious that would soon transform everything around it. Well, Soren said, glancing at his watch, whatever it is, I hope it can wait until after breakfast. I have a conference call at 2. I smiled and began clearing the dishes. Of course, sweetheart, there's plenty of time for everything. But as I watched my children settle into comfortable conversation about their jobs and children and everyday concerns, I knew that time was exactly what we were running out of. The call came on Tuesday morning while I was watering the herb garden eel I had planted the year before he died. Cameron's voice on the phone carried the weight of shared knowledge, the careful tone of someone who'd spent months helping me navigate decisions that would reshape everything. Kale, are you ready for this? Because once I make these calls, there's no going back. I looked out at the Oregon coast, grey and endless under the morning clouds. I've been ready for 6 months, Cameron. Maybe longer. I'll call them this afternoon, ask them to come in Thursday at 2. All 3 together, like you requested. After I hung up, I found myself walking through the house with new eyes, seeing it as my children would when they learned it was no longer theirs to inherit. The built-in bookshelves that Eli and I had designed together, filled with first editions and travel guides and the accumulated knowledge of 2 lifetimes. The kitchen, where I'd packed thousands of school lunches and hosted dozens of foster children. The living room where we'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases and created the kind of memories that make a house into a home. But it was the small bedroom upstairs, the one that had been Jenny's for those crucial months, that held the most weight. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the banister that still showed the nick from when 8-year-old Talia had dragged her bicycle up the steps. Jenny's room had been repurposed as a guest room years ago, but I could still see traces of her presence if I looked closely enough. The window seat, where she'd curled up with books, reading everything in my personal library before moving on to the adult fiction. The corner where she'd set up her art supplies, creating drawings that showed an unusual sophistication for a 9-year-old who'd already lived in 7 different homes. The closet where I'd hung the clothes we'd bought together on our first shopping trip, watching her eyes widen at the idea that these things were hers to keep. She'd been with us for 4 months, longer than any other foster child we'd taken in. Long enough for her to stop flinching when Eli raised his voice during his passionate lectures about historical accuracy. Long enough for her to learn that Sunday mornings meant pancakes and that she was always welcome to help me in the garden. Long enough for me to realize that some connections transcend biology and circumstance. And then one morning, I'd found her bed empty and her few possessions gone. No note, no explanation. The social worker who came to collect her remaining things told me it wasn't unusual. Older children in the system often ran away when placement was working well, unable to trust that good things would last. I'd looked for her, filed reports, made calls, even hired a private investigator when the official channels went cold. But Jenny had vanished into the vast network of streets and shelters and survival that swallows children who don't fit neatly into the system's categories. For 26 years, I'd wondered what happened to the girl who'd called me almost mom because she was afraid to hope for anything more permanent. And then, 3 months ago, she'd walked back into my life as if no time had passed at all. I'd been volunteering at the library's literacy program, helping adults work toward their GEDs, when I looked up from a lesson plan and saw her face, older. Obviously, with the sharp angles of someone who'd learned to take care of herself. But her eyes were the same, dark and intelligent and careful, Miss Kale. She'd said, and my heart had stopped. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. The conversation that followed had been careful, tentative. She'd aged out of the foster system at 18, earned her GED, worked a series of jobs while saving money for community college. She was 17 now, technically still a minor, but living in a transitional housing program for former foster youth. She'd heard about the literacy program and hoped that I might still be involved, what she hadn't said. But what I understood immediately was that she'd spent 8 years looking for a way back to the only place they had ever felt like home. Now, standing in what had been her room, I thought about the conversations that would happen Thursday afternoon. My children would demand explanations, justifications, proof that I hadn't lost my mind. They would want to know why I was giving their inheritance to someone they'd never heard of, someone who had no legal or biological claim to our families. Resources. How could I explain that Jenny's for months with us had changed me more profoundly than any other experience in my adult life? That watching her tentative trust bloom into genuine affection had reminded me what it felt like to be needed for who I was, not just what I provided. That her sudden disappearance had left a hole in my heart that my own children, wonderful as they were, had never been able to fill. The phone rang downstairs, interrupting my reverie. Marin's voice was bright with the forced cheer she used when she was worried about something. "Hi, Mom. I just got the strangest call from Cameron Doyle's office. They want me to come in Thursday afternoon for some kind of meeting about your estate planning, along with Soren and Talia." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settling around me. "Yes, I know about the meeting. Mum, what's going on? You're scaring me a little. Yesterday, you were talking about secrets and changes, and now there are lawyers calling. Are you sick? In some kind of trouble?" "I'm not sick, sweetheart, and I'm not in trouble. I've just made some decisions that I think are important. Decisions about how I want to spend the rest of my life and what I want to leave behind." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marin spoke, her voice smaller than before. "The rest of your life, Mum, you're only 65. That's not old. You could have 20, 30 more years, exactly. And I want to make sure they're the right years. That they're mine." Another pause. "I don't understand what that means." How could she? How could any of them understand that I'd spent the last decade of widowhood slowly remembering who I'd been before I became their mother? That I'd discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten they existed. "You will," I said gently. "Thursday, everything will make sense. Soren's going to lose his mind. You know how he gets about financial stuff." I laughed, remembering my eldest son's reaction when I'd refused to let him refinance the house last year. "Soren will adjust, he always does, and Talia's going to want to process everything to death. She probably suggests we all go to family therapy. That might not be a bad idea, actually, Mum." Marin's voice carried a note of pleading that made my chest tight. "Whatever this is about, whatever you're planning, we love you. You know that, right? We don't always show it perfectly, and we get busy with our own lives, but you're the center of everything for us. You know that." Tears pricked at my eyes, unexpected and sharp. "I know you love me, sweetheart." "That's never been in question. Then why does this feel like you're saying goodbye?" The question hung between us, heavy with the fear that had been building in all my children since I'd started talking about changes and secrets. They thought I was dying, or losing my mind, or planning to do something drastic and self-destructive. In their minds, those were the only explanations for why their predictable, nurturing mother would suddenly become mysterious. "I'm not saying goodbye," I said carefully. "I'm saying hello to a part of my life that I put aside for a long time, to possibilities I thought were close to me. I really don't understand. You will on Thursday, I promise." After I hung up, I walked through the house one more time, mentally cataloguing the items that would need to be divided, donated, or sold. The china cabinet full of dishes that had been my mother's, then mine, but that none of my children had ever expressed interest in. The photograph albums documenting family vacations and school plays and graduations. The lifetime accumulation of books and furniture and art that represented 43 years of marriage and family life. Most of it would go to charity or be sold to settle the estate. The house and its contents, my savings, the small inheritance I'd received from my parents, all of that would go to Jenny, not because my children didn't deserve it, but because they didn't need it the way she did. Soren made more in a month than I'd made in a year as a librarian. Talia had her yoga studio and her husband's stable income. Marin had her teaching position and a pension that would take care of her future. They were established, successful adults with their own resources and support systems. Jenny had aged out of foster care with nothing but her intelligence and determination. She was working 2 jobs while trying to finish high school, living in transitional housing with no safety net except her own resilience. The money I was leaving her wouldn't make her rich, but it would give her choices. It would pay for college, help her start a business, provide the kind of security that would let her take risks and follow dreams instead of just surviving. My children would see it as betrayal, at least at first. They would question my judgment, my mental state, my love for them. They would probably contest the will, demand psychological evaluations, hire lawyers to prove I'd been manipulated or coerced. But eventually, I hoped they would understand that love doesn't always look like what we expect. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is help someone see you as a complete person, rather than just a role in their story. That legacy isn't just about money, it's about the ripple effects of our choices, the lives we touch, the moments when we choose to step outside our expected scripts and become fully ourselves. Thursday afternoon would change everything. But for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than just maintaining what already existed. For the first time since Eli's death, I felt like the protagonist of my own story rather than a supporting character. In everyone else's, the decision had been made. Now all that remained was to face the consequences with as much grace and courage as I could manage. Thursday arrived grey and drizzling, typical Oregon weather that matched my mood perfectly. I spent the morning baking snickerdoodles, Jenny's favourite cookies from when she'd lived with us, and arranging them on the blue ceramic plate she'd always chosen for afternoon snacks. It was a small ritual, but it helped steady my nerves for what was coming. Cameron's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a Victorian house downtown, all dark wood and serious furniture designed to convey stability and trustworthiness. I arrived early, needing a few minutes to center myself before my children walked into what would likely be the most difficult conversation of our relationship. "Are you ready for this?" Cameron asked, settling behind his desk with the manila folder that contained my revised will and the supporting documents. At 58, he'd been practicing law in Cannon Beach for nearly 20 years, long enough to handle everything from simple divorces to complex estate planning. But this afternoon's meeting was unusual even by his standards. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, smoothing my skirt and checking my watch. 5 minutes until my carefully orchestrated family explosion was scheduled to begin, Soren arrived first. Of course, checking his phone as he climbed the stairs. He wore his court suit, navy blue, perfectly pressed, armor against uncertainty. Behind him came Marin, her teacher's cardigan pulled tight against the coastal chill, and finally Talia, her silver jewelry catching the light as she shook rain from her curls. "Mom?" Marin looked confused as she entered Cameron's office and saw me already seated. "What's going on? We thought this was about your will, but you're here too." "Because it is about my will," I said gently. "And I wanted to be here when you heard about the changes I've made." Soren's expression sharpened immediately. "Changes? What kind of changes?" "Mom, we discussed this. Estate planning should be straightforward, especially at your age. Basic distribution among beneficiaries, maybe a few charitable donations. Please, sit down," Cameron interjected, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of delivering unexpected news. "Mrs. Svorall has asked me to explain some significant modifications to her estate planning. My children settled into their chairs with varying degrees of apprehension. Talia perched on the edge of her seat like she was ready to flee or fight. Marin gripped her purse handle with white knuckles. Soren leaned back and crossed his arms, his lawyer's instincts clearly telling him to prepare for battle. The primary change, Marin began, opening the folder and putting on his reading glasses, concerns the disposition of the family home and the majority of Mrs. Svorel's liquid assets. Instead of being divided among her 3 children, these assets will be left to Miss Genevieve Morales. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the rain against the windows and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. My children sat frozen, processing words that made no sense in the context of their understanding of our family. "I'm sorry," Soren said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Did you say Genevieve Morales? I don't know that name. Is she a relative, a family friend? She's someone very important to your mother," Marin said, glancing at me for permission to continue. "Someone who lived with your family many years ago. Lived with us," Talia's voice rose an octave. "When?" "I don't remember anyone named Genevieve." This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for months. The moment when I would have to explain the part of my life my children had either forgotten or never fully understood. The moment when they would learn that their mother had relationships and connections that existed outside their knowledge or experience. "She was 9 years old when she came to us," I said, my voice steady. "Despite the hammering of my heart, one of the foster children your father and I cared for in the early 90s. Before Marin was born." Marin looked stunned. "Foster children?" "Mom, I never knew you fostered kids. It was something your father and I felt called to do. We took in 17 children over 8 years, mostly short-term placements while the county looked for permanent homes." I could see my children struggling to reconcile this information with their understanding of our family history. "Jenny was with us for 4 months, the longest placement we ever had." "For months," Soren repeated, his lawyer brain clearly working, to understand the legal and financial implications. 26 years ago, and now you're leaving her your entire estate." "Not my entire estate. You'll each receive something, of course. But yes, the majority of my assets will go to Jenny." Talia stood up abruptly, her bracelets jangling with agitation. "This is insane, Mom. You can't just give everything to some random person we've never heard of. She was a foster child for 4 months decades ago. That doesn't make her family, doesn't it?" I asked quietly, "What makes someone family, Talia?" "DNA, time, legal documents, or the way they touch your life and change something fundamental inside you. Blood makes someone family," Soren said firmly. "Legal relationships, shared history and responsibility. Not some sentimental attachment to a child who passed through your house decades ago." I reached into my purse and pulled out the drawing. I'd been carrying since Tuesday a piece of construction paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were soft as fabric. I handed it to Marin, who was sitting closest to me. "She made this for me before she left," I said. "Look at it." Marin unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a crayon drawing of a house with 4 stick figures standing in front of it. The figures were labeled in a child's careful printing: Dad, Mom, Jenny, and everyone else. Below the drawing, in purple crayon, were the words, "Thank you for making me feel safe." "She called me almost Mom," I continued, watching my daughter's face soften as she studied the drawing. "Because she was afraid to hope for anything permanent. But for 4 months, she was as much a part of this family as any of you. And then, what happened to her?" Marin asked, passing the drawing to Talia, who examined it with reluctant interest. "She ran away." It happens with older kids in the system. They get scared when things are going well, when they start to believe they might have found a permanent home. The social worker said she probably couldn't trust that good things would last. "So she left," Soren said. "She made a choice to leave your family, and now, 26 years later, you're rewarding that choice with our inheritance." The edge in his voice cut deeper than I'd expected. I could see him calculating, analyzing, trying to find the flaw in my reasoning that would allow him to contest the will or prove I was suffering from diminished capacity. "She didn't leave because she didn't love us," I said. "She left because she loved us too much to believe it was real." She was 9 years old, Soren. 9 years old, and she'd already learned that good things don't last, that people you love disappear or send you away. But that was her choice, he insisted. Her decision. Why should we pay for it now? Because it wasn't really a choice, Talia said unexpectedly, her voice thoughtful as she continued studying Jenny's drawing. Was it, Mom? I mean, she was a kid, a traumatized kid who'd been bounced around the system. That's not really choosing, that's surviving. I looked at my middle daughter with surprise and gratitude. Talia's emotional intelligence often got buried under her scattered energy, but sometimes she saw straight to the heart of things in ways that astounded me. Exactly, I said. And now she's 17, trying to finish high school while working 2 jobs, living in transitional housing with no family support. The money I'm leaving her won't make her rich, but it will give her choices. It will let her go to college, start a business, build a life instead of just surviving. Where is she now? Marin asked quietly. How did you find her again? She found Emmy 3 months ago at the library literacy program. She'd been looking for a way back for years, and when she heard I was volunteering there, I trailed off, remembering that first tentative conversation, the way her voice had shaken when she'd said my name. You've been in contact with her for 3 months. Soren's voice carried a note of betrayal that made my chest tight. And you didn't tell us. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to understand what it meant, having her back in my life, and I wanted to make my decision about the will before emotions got complicated. Talia laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Mom, emotions are already complicated. We're talking about our family, our history, our future. How much more complicated could it get? Marin cleared his throat gently. If I may, he said, Mrs. Vorel has been very clear about her intentions. The will is legally sound, properly witnessed, and reflects her considered judgment about how she wants her assets distributed. She's not required to justify her decisions to anyone. But morally, Soren said, leaning forward in his chair, doesn't she have an obligation to her own children? We're the ones who've been here. Mom, we're the ones who visited you after Dad died, who helped you through your grief, who've been part of your life consistently for decades. The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy with resentment and hurt. I could see 20 years of assumptions crumbling in my children's faces, assumptions about inheritance, about family loyalty, about their place in my life and affections. You've been wonderful children, I said carefully, all of you. You've built successful lives, you've given me grandchildren, you've been sources of pride and joy. But you've also been my job for so long that I sometimes forgot I was supposed to be a person too. Your job. Marin's voice was small and hurt. Is that how you think of being our mother? As work? Not work in a negative sense. But it was work, the constant caregiving and nurturing and sacrificing pieces of myself to meet your needs. And it was work I loved, work that gave my life meaning and purpose. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of who I was when I wasn't taking care of someone else. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where tourists in rain slickers wandered between art galleries and coffee shops. This town had been my home for 43 years, but I'd experienced most of it through the lens of mother and wife. How long had it been since I'd walked these streets just for myself? Jenny needs me in a way you don't anymore, I continued, still facing the window. Not because she's more deserving or more important, but because she's at a place in her life where help can make the difference between thriving and just surviving. You 3 are established. You have careers and homes and support systems. You don't need my money to build good lives. But we thought... Marin's voice broke slightly. We thought we'd pass the house down to our kids, that it would stay in the family. I turned back to face them, seeing the grief in their faces. They weren't just losing an inheritance, they were losing a future that imagined, a legacy that assumed was theirs by right. The house will stay in a family, I said gently. Just not ours. The drive home from Cameron's office passed in a blur of grey sky and familiar landmarks that suddenly felt foreign. My children had left the meeting in various states of shock and anger, promising to call later once they'd had time to process. Soren had muttered something about consulting his own attorney. Talia had hugged me fiercely before walking away without a word. Marin had simply stared at me like I'd become a stranger. At home, I made tea and sat in Eli's chair, watching the afternoon light fade over the Pacific. The house felt different now that the secret was out, as if the walls themselves had exhaled, after holding their breath for months. But with the relief came a new kind of anxiety, the knowledge that I'd irrevocably changed my relationship with my children, possibly forever. The phone rang twice before evening, both times from Soren. I let it go to voicemail, not yet ready for the arguments and accusations I knew were coming. Instead, I pulled out Eli's travel journals, thick leather-bound books filled with his careful handwriting and detailed observations from research trips that had taken him away for weeks at a time. I'd never read them before, during our marriage. They'd seemed like private work documents, part of the academic world that existed parallel to our family life. But now, as I opened the first journal and began reading his account of a 3-week trip to Civil War battlefields, I realized they were also a record of our marriage from his perspective, a perspective I'd never fully understood. Day 12 in Gettysburg, I read, the Historical Society here has documents that completely contradict the accepted timeline of the 15th, Maine's arrival. Fascinating stuff. The kind of discovery that makes all the time away worthwhile. Called home tonight. Cale sounded tired, Talia's been acting up again, and Soren's got some kind of science project due. I know I should feel guilty about being away so much, but honestly, I'm better at this than I am at the daily grind of family life. Cale handles all that so much more naturally than I ever could. I turn the page, my heart aching for the younger version of myself who'd never known her husband felt like an outsider in his own family. Day 3 in Charleston. The archives here are a treasure trove. I could spend months just cataloguing what they have. Got a letter from Cale today, Marin's. First tooth came out. I missed it, of course. Sometimes I wonder if my children will remember me as the father who was always somewhere else, chasing dead people's stories instead of being present for their lives. But this work matters. These stories need to be preserved. Surely they'll understand that someday. The journals painted a picture of a man who loved his family, but felt more comfortable with historical figures than with the living, breathing people who shared his home. Page after page revealed his struggle to balance passion for his work with the guilt of frequent absence, his assumption that I was naturally better suited to the daily work of parenting and household management. What struck me most was how little he seemed to know about my inner life. He wrote about my efficiency and nurturing nature as if they were simple facts rather than choices I made daily, often at the expense of my own interests and dreams. He never mentioned my own academic background, my love of literature, my desire to write. To him, I existed primarily as the steady center that allowed his life to remain in motion. Day 18 in Williamsburg. Cale called tonight with news that she's pregnant again. We hadn't planned on a third child, but she seems happy about it. She's so good at this whole motherhood thing, I swear she was born to it. Sometimes I watch her with the kids and feel like an imposter. They light up when she walks in a room in a way they never do for me. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's better to be really good at one thing than mediocre at everything. I closed the journal and pressed my hands to my eyes, remembering that phone call. I'd been excited about Marin's pregnancy, but also exhausted from managing 2 children, largely on my own, while Eli traveled for months at a time. I'd wanted him to be excited too, to reassure me that we could handle 3 children when I often felt overwhelmed by 2. Instead, he'd congratulated me and immediately started planning his next research trip, as if my pregnancy was confirmation that I had everything under control at home. The journals revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped our marriage. Eli had seen my competence as proof that I didn't need him, when what I'd needed was partnership. He'd interpreted my ability to manage alone as preference for managing alone. And I'd been too tired to focus on keeping everything together to explain the difference. By the time I'd worked through 3 journals, it was nearly 9 o'clock. The phone rang again, Marin this time, and I decided to answer. Mom, her voice was thick with tears. I've been thinking about today, and I just ... I need to understand. Help me understand. What do you want to know, sweetheart? Everything. The foster kids, this girl Jenny, why you never told us about any of it? I feel like I don't know you at all. I set down Eli's journal and walked to the kitchen, needing something to do with my hands while I tried to explain 26 years of choices and silences. You were born in 1991, I began, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator to make tomorrow's breakfast. We stopped fostering when I got pregnant with you because your father was traveling so much, and I knew I couldn't handle a new baby plus foster children on my own. But you had foster kids for 8 years before that, 7 years, actually. From 1984 to 1991, 17 children total, ranging from emergency overnight placements to longer stays like Jenny's. Why didn't you ever talk about it? I mean, 7 years of your life, 17 kids, that's not a small thing to just never mention. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I measured flour into a bowl, thinking about how to explain decisions that had seemed natural at the time but look strange in retrospect. Your father wasn't entirely comfortable with fostering, I said finally. He supported it because he knew it was important to me, but it disrupted his work routine. When we stopped, it felt easier to just move forward, focus on our family. As it was, but didn't you miss it? The fostering. Every day, the admission came out more forcefully than I'd intended. I missed it every single day. But by the time you kids were old enough for me to consider starting again, your father's travel schedule had gotten even more demanding. I couldn't manage foster children and 3 teenagers while he was gone for months at a time, so you just gave up something you loved. I made a choice. I chose to focus on you 3 instead of continuing something that would have been complicated and difficult. It was the right choice for our family at the time, but maybe not the right choice for you. The question hung between us, carrying implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready to explore fully. I was your mother, I said quietly. That was my priority. Everything else was secondary, but now we're grown up. Now you could foster. Again, if you wanted to. You could have both us and that work you loved. Why leave everything to one person instead of finding ways to help lots of kids? It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly over the past few months. Why focus all my resources on Jenny instead of creating a scholarship fund or supporting foster care programs more broadly? Because it's not about the fostering, I said. It's about her specifically, about the connection we had and the way her disappearance haunted me for 26 years. About the second chance we've been given to be in each other's lives. But Mum, she left. She ran away from you. How do you know she won't do it again? I don't, but that's not the point. The point is that she needed me once in a way that changed who I was, and now she needs me again. Whether or not she stays in my life permanently doesn't change my obligation. To help her when I can, your obligation, my choice, I corrected. My choice to use what I have to make a difference in someone's life at the moment when it could matter most. Marin was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing, imagining her sitting in her own kitchen, trying to reconcile the mother she'd always known with this new version who made unilateral decisions about family resources. What about us? She asked finally. What about our choice to be part of that decision? Don't we get a say in how our family history gets written? You're not children anymore, sweetheart. You don't need my protection or my financial support to build good lives. But Jenny does. And maybe, just maybe, helping her is also helping all the other foster children who never got a fair chance, who aged out of the system with nothing but their own resilience to rely on. So this is about guilt. About all the kids you couldn't help. This is about love, I said firmly. About recognizing that love doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. About understanding that family isn't just biology, it's also choice and connection and the willingness to show up for someone when they need you most. After I hung up, I finished preparing breakfast ingredients and went upstairs to Jenny's old room. Tomorrow, I would call her and ask if she wanted to come for dinner over the weekend. I would tell her about the will, about my children's reaction, about the difficult conversations that lay ahead. But tonight, I sat in the window seat where she'd once curled up with books, holding Eli's journals and thinking about the different Ways we love people, the different ways we fail them, and the sometimes surprising opportunities we get to make things right. Outside, the Oregon coast stretched dark and endless under a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, my children were struggling to understand how their predictable mother had become someone they didn't recognize. Somewhere else, Jenny was probably working a late shift at one of her 2 jobs, unaware that her life was about to change completely. And here, in the house that had sheltered so many different versions of family over the years, I sat with the peaceful certainty that I'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the expected choice, but the right one, the choice to finally live as the protagonist of my own story rather than the supporting character in everyone else's. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning, jolting me from deep sleep with the particular urgency that morning phone calls always carry. I fumbled for the receiver, my heart already racing with the assumption that something terrible had happened to one of my children. Kale, the voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Dr. Martinez from Providence Hospital. I have Genevieve Morales here, and she asked me to call you. She's been in an accident." The room spun slightly as I sat up, trying to process the words through the fog of interrupted sleep. "An accident? Is she okay? How bad?" "She's stable," Dr. Martinez interrupted, gently. "Broken ribs, some internal bruising, but nothing life-threatening. She was hit by a car while walking home from work last night." The driver fled the scene. I was already reaching for my clothes, the phone cradle between my shoulder and ear. "I'll be right there." "Which hospital? What does she need?" "Providence, downtown. She's been asking for you since she regained consciousness." "The thing is ... double quotes." He paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "She listed you as her emergency contact. We need to verify, are you her legal guardian, family member?" The question hit me like a physical blow. In the eyes of the law, the hospital system, official records, I was nothing to Jenny, just a woman she'd once lived with briefly, decades ago. I had no legal right to make medical decisions, no official standing to advocate for her care. I struggled to find words that would convey the truth of our relationship without getting tangled in legal complexities. "I'm the closest thing to family she has." The drive to Portland took 45 minutes through early morning fog that seemed to mirror my emotional state, thick, uncertain, occasionally clearing to reveal glimpses of the road ahead. I called Marin on the way, waking him to ask about emergency guardianship procedures, medical power of attorney, the legal steps that might allow me to help Jenny navigate whatever came next. "Kale, slow down," he said, his voice heavy with sleep and concern. "She's 17, nearly an adult. And you said she's stable. Let's focus on immediate needs first, then worrying about legal paperwork." But I couldn't slow down. The accident had crystallized something that had been building since Thursday's meeting with my children, the recognition that my commitment to Jenny couldn't remain theoretical or sentimental. If I was going to step back into her life in a meaningful way, I needed to be prepared for all the complications that came with it. Providence Hospital's emergency room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday morning soccer injuries, household accidents, the accumulated minor crises of weekend life. I gave Jenny's name at the desk and was directed to a curtained alcove in the back corner. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and monitors that beeped steadily. Her dark hair was matted with dry blood from a scalp laceration that had been stitched closed. Purple bruises bloomed across her visible skin like dark flowers. "Miss Kale." Her voice was hoarse but alert. "You came." "Of course I came." I pulled a chair close to her bed, fighting the urge to smooth her hair the way I would have when she was 9. "How are you feeling?" The doctor said broken ribs, 3 of them. "And they're keeping me for observation because I hit my head pretty hard." She shifted carefully, wincing. "I'm sorry they called you. I know, this is probably weird, listing you as my emergency contact when we've only just reconnected. But I don't really have anyone else." The casual way she said it, "I don't really have anyone else," broke my heart. Here was a 17-year-old girl who'd survived 8 years in the foster system and aged out with so little support that a woman she'd lived with briefly in childhood was her closest connection. "Don't apologize. I'm glad you called me. I'm glad you knew you could call me. I reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. What happened? The doctor mentioned a hit and run. I was walking home from my night shift at the diner. It was late, maybe 1 a.m., and I was on that stretch of Commercial Street where the lighting isn't great. I heard the car coming fast behind me, but I was on the sidewalk, so I thought I was safe. She paused, her eyes distant. Next thing I knew, I was waking up here. Did you see the car? The driver, dark sedan, maybe blue or black. It happened so fast. And honestly, I was more focused on whether I was dying than on getting a license plate number. A nurse appeared at the curtain, checking monitors and asking about pain levels. While Jenny answered questions about nausea and dizziness, I found myself studying her face, looking for traces of the 9-year-old who'd once called me almost mom. The bone structure was the same, the intelligent dark eyes, the way she chewed her bottom lip when concentrating. But life had carved new lines. Around those familiar features: wariness, premature maturity, the kind of hypervigilance that comes from years of taking care of yourself. The police want to talk to you, the nurse told Jenny, but the doctor said it could wait until you're feeling stronger. There's also some paperwork about insurance and billing. I don't have insurance, Jenny said matter-of-factly. I'm between jobs. Well, I have 2 part-time jobs, but neither one offers benefits. I'll have to work out a payment plan or something. I felt something sharp and protective rise in my chest. We'll figure out the insurance situation. Don't worry about that. Right now. After the nurse left, Jenny turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Miss Cale, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course, when I showed up at the library 3 months ago, were you happy to see me? Or were you just being polite because you're a nice person who couldn't turn away someone from your past? The question caught me off guard with its directness and underlying vulnerability. Here she was, lying in a hospital bed after being hit by a car, and she was worried about whether she was imposing on my kindness. I was happy, I said without hesitation, happier than I'd been in years. Do you want to know what I did after you left that day? She nodded. I went home and pulled out a photo album I'd hidden away for 26 years. Full of pictures of all the foster children your father and I had cared for. And I sat in your old room and cried not sad tears, but relief tears, because for 26 years I'd wondered what happened to you, whether you were safe, whether you remembered our time together as fondly as I did. You kept pictures, I kept everything. Drawings you made, books you'd left behind, even the hair ribbon you forgot on your dresser. I told myself it was just in case you came back, but really, I think I kept it all because letting go felt like losing you twice. Jenny's eyes filled with tears. I thought about you so much over the years. Whenever things got really bad, I'd remember Sunday morning pancakes and the way you'd read to me before bed. I'd remember feeling safe. You were safe, and you're safe now, but I'm not a kid anymore. I can't just move back into your house and pretend the last 8 years didn't happen. I've got responsibilities, jobs, a life I've built. Messy and complicated as it is, I squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking you to be a child again. I'm asking if you want to be part of a family. A different kind of family than we had before. But family nonetheless. What does that mean exactly? This was the moment I'd been building towards since Thursday's meeting, since the phone call that morning, since the first time I'd seen her face again at the library. The moment when I stopped talking about hypothetical choices and made concrete ones. It means I want to help you finish high school, go to college if that's what you want. It means you have a place to stay when transitional housing doesn't work out. It means you have someone to call when you're scared or hurt or just need to talk. I paused, gathering courage for the next part. And it means that when I die, you'll inherit enough to build whatever kind of life you want to build. Miss K-A-Y-L-E... Her voice was barely above a whisper. You can't mean that. You have children, a real family. I can't take what belongs to them. You're not taking anything. I'm giving it. There's a difference, but they'll hate me. They'll think I manipulated you or took advantage of your kindness. They might, at least at first. But that's my problem. To handle, not yours. Your only job is to decide whether you want what I'm offering. Jenny closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. I've been alone for so long. I forgot what it felt like to have someone care whether I came home safe. At night, you don't have to be alone anymore. Not if you don't want to be. What about your children? How do I explain myself to them? How do I justify taking their inheritance? You don't explain anything to them. You just live your life, make good choices, and let them see over time that their mother's judgment wasn't as flawed as they initially thought. A doctor appeared at the curtain, clipboard in hand. Miss Morales, we're ready to discharge you, but we need to go over some follow-up care instructions. You'll need to take it easy for the next few weeks. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity. Do you have somewhere safe to recover? Jenny looked at me, a question in her eyes. She be staying with me? I said firmly. Whatever she needs. After we'd completed the discharge paperwork and I'd settled the initial hospital bill money, that would come from the account my children assumed was part of their inheritance. We drove home in comfortable silence. Jenny dozed against the passenger window while I navigated the coastal highway and thought about the phone calls I'd need to make. I'd have to tell my children about the accident, about Jenny staying with me during her recovery. I'd have to explain that their theoretical concerns about my will had suddenly become very real, very present. That the girl they'd never met was now sleeping in their childhood home, occupying space they'd assumed was theirs by right. But first, I needed to get Jenny settled in her old room, to make her comfortable and safe in the place where she'd once been happy. Everything else could wait until she was stronger, until we'd both had time to adjust to this new reality we were creating together. As we pulled into my driveway, Jenny opened her eyes and looked at the house with an expression of wonder and disbelief. It looks exactly the same, she murmured. Some things don't change, I said. The best things never do. The first week of Jenny's recovery passed in a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. The constant awareness of another person's needs, the gentle choreography of shared space, the particular satisfaction that comes from nurturing someone back to health. She spent most of her time reading in the living room or napping in her old bedroom, moving carefully to accommodate healing ribs and persistent headaches from her concussion. I found myself remembering skills I'd thought were dormant: how to make meals appealing to someone with little appetite, how to offer help without overwhelming someone fiercely independent, how to provide comfort without being intrusive. It was like rediscovering a language I'd once spoken fluently, but hadn't used in years. My children, predictably, had mixed reactions to the news of Jenny's accident and her presence in the house. Marin called every other day, ostensibly to check on the girl, but really to gauge whether my decision about the will was holding firm. Her conversations with me had become careful and polite, as if she was speaking to a distant relative. Rather than her mother, Talia sent a basket of herbal teas and healing crystals with a note that read, "For your friend's recovery and your own clarity." I wasn't sure whether the gift was genuine concern or pointed commentary on my mental state. Soren's response was the most direct, a certified letter from his law firm requesting copies of my medical records for the past year, along with documentation of any medications I was taking that might affect cognitive function. The letter was professionally worded, but its intent was clear. He was building a case to contest the will on grounds of diminished capacity. I showed the letter to Marin over coffee at our usual downtown cafe, watching his expression grow grimmer as he read. "He's within his rights to request this information," Marin said finally. "But Kale, you need to understand what's happening here. Your children are circling the wagons. They're not just questioning your decision, they're questioning your ability to make decisions at all." "I know. I expected it, did you? Because this could get ugly very quickly. Family will contests are some of the most vicious legal battles I've ever witnessed. Relationships get destroyed permanently." I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded me of the fog over the ocean. "What would you do, Marin, if you were in my position?" "Honestly, I'd probably do exactly what you're doing. But I'd also be prepared for the possibility that you might lose your children in the process." The weight of that possibility settled over me like a physical thing. I'd known, intellectually, that my decision might damage my relationships with Soren, Talia, and Marin, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the risk feel more real, more permanent. "They're angry now," I said. "But surely, over time, they'll understand." And maybe Or maybe they'll spend the rest of your life believing that you chose a stranger over your own family. Maybe they'll never forgive you for keeping secrets, for making unilateral decisions about family resources, for fundamentally changing their understanding of who you are. I thought about Eli's journals, still sitting on my nightstand, filled with observations about family dynamics from someone who'd always felt slightly outside them. He'd written extensively about the difficulty of balancing personal passion with family obligation, about the guilt that came from pursuing work that took him away from home. But he'd never questioned his right to make those choices, never doubted that his family would ultimately support his decisions. Why, then, was my choice to prioritize someone outside my immediate family being met with such resistance? Was it because I was a mother, expected to put my children's interests above all others indefinitely? Was it because the money involved felt like a finite resource that should be preserved for blood relatives? Or was it because my children had simply never seen me as a complete person with my own relationships and loyalties? There's something else, Marin said, interrupting my thoughts. I got a call yesterday from a private investigator. Someone hired him to look into Genevieve's background, her recent activities, her relationship with you. A chill ran down my spine. Someone hired a private investigator. He wouldn't say who, but it's not hard to guess. They're looking for evidence that she's manipulating you, taking advantage of your age or emotional state. They want to prove she's after your money. That's ridiculous. She didn't even know about the will until this week. I know that. And you know that. But to someone looking for evidence of exploitation, the timing could look suspicious. She reconnects with you 3 months ago. You change your will. She gets hurt and moves into your house from the outside. It could appear orchestrated. I felt a familiar surge of protectiveness, the same fierce instinct that had driven me to step between playground bullies and foster children decades ago. She was hit by a car, Marin. She's 17 years old with broken ribs and no family. What was I supposed to do? Leave her to recover alone in transitional housing? I'm not criticizing your choice. I'm warning you that your children might interpret your generosity as evidence that you're being manipulated. That evening, I sat with Jenny on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and orange. She was moving more easily now, able to sit upright without wincing, though she still pressed her hand to her ribs when she laughed. I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital, she said, her voice careful, about family and inheritance and helping me build whatever kind of life I want to build. And I think maybe I should leave, go back to transitional housing, figure out my own way forward. This is causing too many problems for you. I turned to study her profile, noting the stubborn set of her jaw that I remembered from her childhood. What makes you think that? The letters. The phone calls where you talk in whispers. The way you look worried even when you're smiling. She faced me directly. I know your kids are upset about the will. And I know having me here is making everything worse. My children are adults, I said firmly. They're entitled to their feelings, but they're not entitled to dictate my choices. And you're not responsible for their reactions, but I'm complicating your life. The last thing I want is to be the reason you lose your relationship with your children. Jenny, look at me. I waited until she met my eyes. 26 years ago, you left because you couldn't trust that good things would last. You ran away because you were afraid of being disappointed or abandoned. Are you doing the same thing now? Her face crumpled slightly. Maybe, but maybe I'm also trying to protect you from having to choose between me and them. I'm not choosing between you and them. I'm choosing to live according to my own values and convictions instead of other people's expectations. There's a difference, but what if they never forgive you? What if helping me cost you your relationships with your own children? It was the question that had been keeping me awake at night, the fear that lived underneath my confident exterior. What if Marin was right? What if my decision to reclaim my agency, to live as the protagonist of my own story, ultimately left me isolated from the people I'd loved longest? Then that's a price I'll have to live with, I said finally, but I don't think it will come to that. My children are good people, Jenny. They're hurt and confused right now, but they're not cruel. Eventually, they'll see that my love for you doesn't diminish my love for them. How can you be so sure? Because love isn't a finite resource. It doesn't get used up or divided into smaller pieces when you share it with more people. If anything, love multiplies when you give it away. We sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared over the ocean. Inside the house, I could hear the familiar sounds of home, the refrigerator humming, the grandfather clock chiming the hour, the old floorboards settling for the night. Miss Cale. Jenny said, finally, what would you like me to call you? Now, I can't keep calling you Miss Cale forever, but Mom feels presumptuous. I thought about all the names I'd carried over the years: daughter, wife, mother, librarian, caregiver. All the roles that had defined me in relation to other people, other needs, other expectations. What would you like to call me? I don't know what feels right to you. How about just Cale? We're family, but we're also friends. We're creating our own relationship, not trying to recreate something from the past. Cale, she repeated, testing the sound. I like that. It feels honest, good, because honesty is all we have, really. Everything else, the money, the house, the legal documents, that's just paperwork. What matters is that we're choosing each other, freely and honestly, despite all the complications. Later that night, after Jenny had gone to bed, I found myself writing letters. I might never send explanations to my children about choices they might never understand. In the letters, I tried to articulate what I'd been unable to express in person, that loving Jenny didn't mean I loved them less, that providing for her future didn't diminish my pride in theirs, that the decision to leave her my estate was about recognizing where help was most needed rather than rewarding proximity or biology. But as I wrote, I realized that no amount of explanation would change the fundamental disconnect between their expectations and my actions. They saw inheritance as a birthright, a reward for being good children, a symbol of parental love. I saw it as a tool for creating opportunity, a way to make a meaningful difference in someone's life at the moment when it could matter most. The difference wasn't just about money, it was about completely different philosophies of love, obligation, and family loyalty. And bridging that gap would require more than words. It would require time, patience, and the willingness to live with uncertainty about whether our relationships could survive such fundamental disagreement. Outside my window, the Oregon coast stretched dark and mysterious under a sky full of stars. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded its lonely warning. And upstairs, in the room that had once been hers and was hers again, Jenny slept safely under my roof, healing from physical wounds while I wrestled with the emotional ones that my choices had opened in our small, complicated family. 3 weeks after Jenny's accident, Soren called to request a family meeting. Not ask, request, in the careful language he used with opposing counsel. His tone was professional, controlled, but I could hear the steel underneath. We need to talk, Mom, all of us together, about this situation you've created, this situation. I kept my voice level despite the spike of defensiveness his words triggered. You mean having someone injured recover in my home? I mean the fundamental changes you've made to our family dynamic without consulting anyone. The financial decisions that affect all of us. He paused, and I could almost see him choosing his words carefully. The concerning pattern of behavior that's emerged since this girl reappeared in your life. There it was, the accusation wrapped in legal language. I wasn't just making choices they disagreed with. I was exhibiting concerning behavior that suggested diminished capacity. What kind of meeting did you have in mind? I asked. Dinner, here at my house, tomorrow night at 6. Just family. Rachel's taking the kids to her mother's for the evening. And Jenny? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Soren spoke, his voice carefully neutral. This is a family conversation, Mom, about family business. Jenny is family now, according to you. But the rest of us might see things differently. After I hung up, I found Jenny in the garden, carefully weeding around the tomato plants. Her movements were still cautious, protecting her healing ribs, but being outside seemed to energize her in ways that surprised me. She'd always been an indoor child during her first stay with us, preferring books to gardening. But now she approached the garden with an artist's eye, commenting on color combinations and seasonal planning in ways that revealed a sophisticated understanding of design. Soren wants to have a family meeting tomorrow night, I told her, settling onto the garden bench he had built decades ago. He specifically excluded you from the invitation. She sat back on her heels, soil-stained gloves in her lap. That's okay, I wouldn't want to be there anyway. It sounds like it's going to be pretty intense. It might be, they single quotes struggling with everything that's happened. Your presence here, they're feeling that I've become someone they don't recognize, have you? Become someone they don't recognize. I considered the question seriously. Over the past month, I'd been making decisions based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. I'd been prioritizing my relationship with Jenny over my children's comfort levels. I'd been living as the protagonist of my own story rather than the supporting character in theirs. Maybe I have, I said. Maybe that's not a bad thing. It might be a very bad thing if it costs you your relationships with your children. Are you having second thoughts about staying here, about the will, about any of this? Every day, she admitted, but not because I don't want to be here. Because I'm terrified that wanting it so much will somehow jinx it. That letting myself believe in this family will make it disappear again. Her honesty cut straight through to the heart of what we were both feeling, the fear that building something new might require sacrificing something irreplaceable. What if we made a deal? I said, what if we agreed that no matter what happens, tomorrow night, no matter how angry or hurt my children get, we'll see this through. We'll give our relationship time to develop without letting other people's reactions derail it. What if they hate me forever? What if they never accept me as part of your life? Then we'll figure out how to live with that. But we won't let fear make our decisions for us. Jenny pulled off her gardening gloves and studied her hands stronger, now than they'd been 3 weeks ago, calloused from garden work and still bearing faint scars from the accident. When I was in the system, I learned to pack light. Never get too attached to anything you couldn't carry in one bag, because you never knew when you'd have to leave suddenly. And now I'm learning how to unpack, how to believe that some good things might actually last. She looked up at me with eyes that held both hope and determination. I want to try, Kale. I want to believe that we can build something real here. Even if it's complicated, then that's what we'll do. We'll build something real. The next evening, I drove to Soren's house alone, leaving Jenny with strict instructions to call if she needed anything and a promise that I'd be home by 9 regardless of how the conversation unfolded. His house was a testament to success, contemporary architecture, professionally landscaped yard, the kind of understated elegance that money could buy when guided by good taste. Talia's car was already in the driveway, and I could see Marin's silhouette through the kitchen window, helping with dinner preparations. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of family loyalty, the desire to smooth over conflict and restore harmony. These were my children, people I'd loved and nurtured for decades. Was I really willing to risk those relationships for someone I'd reconnected with only 3 months ago? But then I thought about Jenny in the garden that afternoon, carefully tending plants while talking about learning to unpack, learning to believe in permanence. I thought about the girl who'd once called me almost mom because she was afraid to hope for anything more. And I knew that this wasn't just about money or inheritance, it was about whether I had the courage to live according to my deepest convictions, even when doing so was difficult. Soren answered the door with a stiff embrace and a tight smile. Mom, thanks for coming. The formal greeting set the tone for everything that followed. This wasn't going to be a casual family dinner, it was a carefully orchestrated intervention. In the living room, Talia and Marin sat on opposite ends of the couch-like bookends, their body language suggesting they'd been discussing strategy before my arrival. The coffee table held legal documents, printed emails, and what looked like a psychological evaluation form. Sit down, Mom, Marin said. Gently, we want to talk to you about some concerns we've been having. I remained standing, recognizing the dynamic they were trying to establish. They wanted me seated while they presented their case, wanted to create the visual impression of a tribunal rather than a family conversation. I'll stand, thanks. What kind of concerns? Soren took the lead, his lawyer training evident in the way he organized his presentation. We've been doing some research over the past few weeks into Genevieve Morales's background, her recent activities, her contact with you. You hired a private investigator to spy on her. We hired a professional to verify information, and what we found is troubling. He handed me a manila folder filled with photographs and documents. Pictures of Jenny at work, at her transitional housing facility, walking to the library where we'd reconnected. A timeline of her movements over the past few months, credit reports, school records, employment history. She's been in contact with you longer than she told you, Soren said, watching my face as I flipped through the materials. The investigator found evidence that she'd been tracking your activities for at least 6 months before approaching you at the library. My hand stilled on a photograph of Jenny sitting in her car across the street from my house, taken sometime in early spring. The timestamp showed it was from 2 months before a supposed chance encounter at the literacy program. She researched your volunteer schedule, Talia added, her voice gentler than Soren's, but no less determined. She knew exactly when and where to find you. This wasn't a coincidence, Mom. It was calculated. I studied the evidence they'd compiled, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. The timeline they'd constructed painted a picture of deliberate manipulation, a troubled young woman who'd identified a vulnerable target and carefully orchestrated a reunion designed to appeal to my emotions and maternal instincts. There's more, Marin said quietly. Show her the rest, Soren. The second folder contained financial records showing that Jenny had been struggling with debt, facing eviction from her transitional housing, at risk of dropping out of her GED program due to unpaid fees. The timing lined up perfectly. Her financial crisis had begun approximately 6 months ago, just when the surveillance photos showed her beginning to track my activities. She needed money, Mom, Soren said, and she remembered a woman who'd once been kind to her, someone who might be sympathetic to her situation. So she researched you, learned about your routines, and engineered what you thought was a chance meeting. I sank into the chair I'd refused earlier, the weight of their evidence making it impossible to remain standing. Even if this is true, I said slowly, it doesn't change anything fundamental. She still needed help. I was still in a position to provide it. But it changes everything about her motives, Talia protested. She didn't reach out because she missed you or wanted to reconnect. She reached out because she needed money and thought you'd be an easy target. And it worked, Soren added. She got you to change your will, got you to take her into your home, got you to pay her medical bills. In less than 3 months, she went from homeless and broke to being your sole heir. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Soren's expensive wall clock. My children watched me process their evidence. Their faces a mixture of concern and vindication. They'd built a compelling case, supported by documentation and timeline analysis that would be convincing in any court of law. But as I sat there, surrounded by photographs and financial records and evidence of careful planning, I found myself thinking about the drawing Jenny had made as a 9-year-old, the crayon house with 4 stick figures, and the words, "Thank you for making me feel safe." I thought about the way she'd cried when I told her she didn't have to be alone anymore. I thought about her hands in the garden soil, learning to believe in permanence. You're right, I said finally, looking up at my children's expectant faces. She probably did plan our meeting. She probably researched my routines and engineered our reunion because she was desperate, and I represented her best hope for help. Relief flooded their expressions. Soren leaned forward, his voice gentle now. That he thought he'd won. Mom, we understand how this happened. She manipulated your emotions, took advantage of your generous nature, but it's not too late to fix this. We can change the will back, ask her to leave, put safeguards in place to prevent this kind of exploitation. In the future, no, I said quietly, no. Marin looked confused. Mom, you just agreed that she manipulated you. I agreed that she probably planned our meeting. But manipulation implies that her feelings aren't genuine, that her need isn't real. And I don't believe that. How can you not believe it? Talia's voice rose with frustration. We just showed you proof. You showed me proof that she was desperate, enough to seek help from someone who'd been kind to her years ago. You showed me proof that she was strategic about how she approached me. But you didn't show me proof that her emotions are fake or that her gratitude isn't real. Soren stood and began pacing, his careful composure finally cracking. Mum, listen to yourself. You're defending someone who lied to you, who manipulated you, who's taking advantage of your grief and loneliness. I'm not grieving, I interrupted sharply. And I'm not lonely. I'm a woman who made a conscious decision to help someone who needed help. The fact that she was smart enough to research the best way to approach me doesn't make her a criminal. It makes her a survivor. But the money, Mum, Marin pleaded. Our inheritance, the house, everything Dad worked for is mine to do with as I choose. And I choose to give it to someone who will use it to build a life instead of just adding to assets you already have. The argument that followed was unlike anything we'd ever experienced as a family. Voices were raised, accusations were made, and decades of buried resentments surfaced in ways that surprised all of us. Soren questioned my mental capacity. Talia accused me of replacing my real children with a fantasy daughter. Marin cried and begged me to reconsider, to think about what I was doing to our family. But underneath their anger and hurt, I could hear fear that I didn't love them enough, fear that they weren't important to me, fear that their predictable, reliable mother had become someone they couldn't understand or control. When I finally left at 9 o'clock, as promised, the silence that followed my departure felt permanent in a way that frightened me. I'd stood my ground, defended my choices, refused to be swayed by evidence that painted Jenny in an unflattering light. But I'd also potentially severed relationships that had been central to my identity for decades. At home, I found Jenny waiting in the kitchen with tea and the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from years of reading adult moods for signs of danger. How bad was it? She asked simply. Pretty bad. They have evidence that you researched me before approaching me at the library. That our meeting wasn't the coincidence you let me believe it was. Her face went very still. What kind of evidence? I showed her the photographs, the timeline, the financial records that painted a clear picture of calculated planning. She examined each item carefully, her expression unreadable. Are you going to ask me to leave? She said finally, are you going to lie to me about what really happened? She set down the photographs and looked directly into my eyes. I had been watching you for about 2 months before I approached you at the library. I researched your schedule, your volunteer activities, your routine. I planned our meeting because I was desperate, and you were the only person I could think of who might help me. Why didn't you just tell me that from the beginning? Because I was ashamed, because admitting that I'd sought you out deliberately made me feel like I was using you, even though that wasn't how it felt emotionally. Because I was afraid you'd think less of me if you knew how calculated I'd been. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But what I saw was the same honesty that had characterized our relationship since her return. Painful, unflinching truthfulness about complicated emotions and difficult circumstances. Do you regret it? I asked. The way you approach me, I regret the dishonesty. But I don't regret finding you again. And I don't regret accepting your help, even if your children think I should. What we do next is up to you, I said. You can leave, if that feels right. You can stay, if you want to weather whatever comes next. But I'm not making this decision for you. You're old enough to choose your own path. She was quiet for a long time, her hands wrapped around her tea mug, like she was drawing warmth from it. Finally, she looked up with an expression of determination I remembered from her childhood. I want to stay. Not because of the money or the house or any of that. But because for the first time in 8 years, I feel like I'm home, and I don't want to run away from that feeling anymore. Even if it means facing your children's anger, then we'll face it together, I said. Whatever comes next. Outside, the Oregon wind howled around the house, rattling windows and reminding us both that storms were part of life on the coast. But inside, warmed by tea and honest conversation and the decision to choose each other despite all the complications, we felt as safe as two people could feel in an uncertain world. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a process server who looked embarrassed to be handing a lawsuit to a grandmother in her bathrobe. The thick envelope contained a petition to contest my will, a motion for psychological evaluation, and a restraining order requiring me to cease All financial transactions over $500 without court approval. My children had made good on their threats. They were taking me to court. I sat at the kitchen table reading through the legal language while Jenny made coffee, her movements automatic but tense. Over the past month, since the confrontation at Soren's house, my relationship with my children had deteriorated into formal communications through lawyers and the occasional terse text message. They'd stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped treating me like someone capable of making my own decisions. They're asking for a psychological evaluation, I told Jenny, setting down the papers. And a financial competency hearing. They want a judge to determine whether I'm mentally fit to control my own assets. Can they do that? Apparently so. Adult children can petition the court if they believe a parent is suffering from diminished capacity that affects their ability to make rational financial decisions. Jenny poured coffee with hands that shook slightly. This is my fault. If I hadn't come back into your life as stop, I stood and took the coffee from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes that had been there since the lawsuit papers arrived. This isn't about you. This is about my children's inability to accept that I'm a complete person with my own relationships and values. But they're not wrong about the way I approached you. I did manipulate the situation. You were strategic about asking for help. There's a difference. Over the next weeks, as we prepared for court appearances and depositions, I learned things about my children that broke my heart. The private investigator they'd hired had compiled a dossier on Jenny that included interviews with former employers, social workers, even other foster children who'd known her during her years in the system. They were building a case that painted her as a manipulative opportunist who targeted vulnerable elderly people before. The picture that emerged was complicated. Yes, Jenny had been strategic about reconnecting with me. Yes, she'd been in desperate financial circumstances when she'd sought me out. But the investigators had also uncovered evidence of her resilience, her determination to build a stable life despite incredible obstacles, her consistent efforts to help other foster children navigate the system. Look at this, Marin said. During one of our preparation sessions, spreading documents across his conference table. Her employment history shows she's never been fired, never missed more than a day or two of work, always gotten positive reviews. Her teachers describe her as exceptionally mature and determined to succeed despite challenging circumstances. Even the social workers who handled her case describe her as one of the most resilient young people we've worked with. But Soren's lawyers will argue that all of this proves she's calculating, I said. That she's learned to manipulate systems and people to get what she needs, possibly. But it also proves she's someone worth investing in. Someone who's used help productively rather than squandering opportunities. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. I spent the preceding days reading about competency assessments, trying to understand what the evaluator would be looking for. What questions might indicate concern about my mental state? Are you nervous? Jenny asked the night before, finding me in the living room with a stack of articles about age-related cognitive decline. Terrified, I admitted, what if they're right? What if I am suffering from some kind of diminished capacity that's affecting my judgment? Do you feel like your judgment is impaired? I considered the question seriously. Over the past 6 months, I'd made decisions that surprised my family and disrupted long-established patterns. I'd chosen to prioritize my relationship with Jenny over my children's comfort. I'd restructured my estate in ways that challenged conventional expectations about inheritance and family loyalty. But none of those decisions felt irrational or impulsive. They felt like the natural result of finally understanding what mattered most to me, finally having the courage to live according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. I feel clearer than I have in years, I said finally. Like I've finally figured out who I am when I'm not trying to be what everyone else needs me to be. The evaluation took place in a sterile office building downtown, conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuropsychologist who specialized in competency assessments. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps mid-40s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that put me somewhat at ease. The testing lasted for hours and covered everything from basic cognitive function to complex decision-making scenarios. I answered questions about my life history, my relationships, my understanding of financial concepts and legal implications. I completed puzzles and memory tests and problem-solving exercises that felt like elaborate games with serious consequences. "Tell me about your decision to change your will," Dr. Chen said during the final hour. "Walk me through your thought process." I explained about Jenny's return to my life, about the connection we'd shared when she was 9, about my understanding of where help was most needed. I talked about my children's established lives and secure futures, about the difference between wanting to leave them something and needing to prioritize someone more vulnerable. "Your children believe you're being manipulated," Dr. Chen said. "How do you respond to that concern?" "I think they're confusing manipulation with strategy." Jenny was strategic about how she approached me because she was desperate, and I represented her best hope for stability. But her emotions are genuine, her gratitude is real, and her need is legitimate, even knowing that she researched you before making contact, that your reunion wasn't the coincidence she initially presented it as. Especially knowing that, it tells me she's intelligent, resourceful, and determined to build a better life. Those are exactly the qualities I want to support. After the evaluation, I drove home through the grey November afternoon feeling emotionally drained, but oddly hopeful. I'd answered every question honestly, demonstrated my understanding of complex financial and legal concepts, shown that my decisions were based on clear reasoning rather than emotional manipulation or cognitive decline. Jenny was waiting with soup and bread, comfort food that reminded me of the lunches I'd packed for foster children decades ago. We ate in companionable silence, both of us avoiding discussion of what the evaluation might mean for our future. "Whatever happens," she said, finally, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my adult life. Even with all the legal drama and family conflict, even knowing that your children hate me, this has felt like coming home. It has been coming home," I said. For both of us, 2 weeks later, Dr. Chen's report arrived by certified mail. I opened it with shaking hands, Jenny reading over my shoulder as I scanned the technical language for the conclusion that would determine whether I retain control over my own life. "The evaluee demonstrates intact cognitive function across all assessed domains," I read aloud. "Her decision-making process regarding estate planning appears rational, well-considered, and consistent with her stated values and priorities. While her choices may be unconventional from a societal perspective, they do not indicate diminished capacity or susceptibility to undue influence." The report went on to describe my psychological stability, my clear understanding of financial implications, my ability to resist manipulation or coercion. In careful, clinical language, Dr. Chen had documented that I was exactly what I'd always known myself to be: a competent adult making difficult but rational decisions about my own life. The competency hearing was scheduled for December 15th, 2 weeks before Christmas. By then, the legal battle had consumed most of my savings and created a rift with my children that felt increasingly permanent. Soren hadn't spoken to me in 2 months. Talia sent occasional text messages asking if I was ready to be reasonable. Marin called once a week, always crying, always begging me to reconsider before it was too late to repair our relationships. Maybe I should withdraw the will, I told Cameron the night before the hearing. Maybe protecting my relationships with my children is more important than providing for Jenny. Is that what you believe? Or is that what you think you should believe? The question kept me awake most of the night. I walked through the house in the darkness, touching familiar objects and remembering the decades of life they represented. Eli's books, still arranged according to his eccentric organizational system. Photo albums documenting my children's growth from babies to adults. The kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. This house held so much history, so much love. Was I really willing to give it all to someone my children saw as an interloper? Was I really prepared to sacrifice relationships that had sustained me for decades? But then I thought about Jenny asleep upstairs, no longer the frightened 9-year-old, who'd called me almost mum, but still someone who needed the security that love and resources could provide. I thought about the difference between equal treatment and equitable support, between maintaining tradition and responding to current need, And I realized that this had never really been about money or houses or legal documents. It had been about the right to live according to my own moral compass, even when doing so disappointed people I loved. It had been about refusing to let other people's expectations define the boundaries of my compassion. The hearing itself was anticlimactic. Judge Patricia Reeves, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than me, reviewed Dr. Chan's report, questioned me briefly about my understanding of the legal proceedings, and then rendered her decision with the kind of judicial efficiency that left no room for argument. The petitioners have failed to demonstrate that Mrs. Vorall lacks the mental capacity to make informed decisions about her estate, she said, her voice carrying across the small courtroom where my children sat on one side and Jenny and I sat on the other. The psychological evaluation clearly establishes her competency, and her testimony today demonstrates a clear understanding of both the implications of her decisions and the concerns of her family members. She paused, looking directly at Soren, Talia, and Marin. While the court understands that family members may disagree with an individual's choices, disagreement is not grounds for declaring someone incompetent. Mrs. Vorall has the right to dispose of her assets as she sees fit, regardless of whether her children approve of those decisions. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. My children filed out without speaking to me, their faces masks of grief and anger. Jenny squeezed my hand as we watched them leave, but I could see the guilt in her eyes, the burden she carried for being the catalyst of our family's destruction. They'll come around, I told her as we walked out into the December afternoon. It might take time, but they'll understand eventually. Do you really believe that? I looked up at the grey sky, heavy with the promise of rain, and realized I didn't know what I believed about my children's capacity for forgiveness. But I knew what I hoped, and sometimes hope was enough to sustain you through the hardest decisions. I believe in the power of love to survive disappointment, I said finally. And I believe that family is what we choose to build together, not just what we inherit by accident of birth. That night, back home in the house that was now officially, legally, irrevocably going to be Jenny's, we made dinner together and talked about the future. She'd been accepted to community college for the spring semester, planning to study art therapy with the goal of eventually working with foster children. The settlement from her hit-and-run accident, combined with the security my inheritance would provide, meant she could focus on education rather than just survival. I want to do something meaningful with this gift you're giving me, she said as we cleaned up the dishes. Not just build a comfortable life for myself, but use it to help other kids who are aging out of the system the way I did. That sounds perfect, but you know you don't owe me anything, right? You don't have to justify your inheritance by promising to save the world. I'm not promising to save the world. I'm promising to live a life that honors what you've given me, to be someone worthy of the love you've shown me. Looking at her across the kitchen, I realized that this was what legacy really meant, not the preservation of material wealth or bloodline continuity, but the creation of opportunities for love to multiply and spread. My decision to leave everything to Jenny wasn't just about providing for her future. It was about trusting her to use that security in ways that would benefit others, to turn my single act of faith into a ripple effect of generosity and care. Outside, the Oregon winter wrapped around our house like a familiar blanket. Inside, we were warm and safe and planning for a future that felt both uncertain and full of possibility. I'd lost my children, at least temporarily. But I'd gained something to the knowledge that I was capable of living according to my deepest convictions, even when doing so required sacrificing relationships that had once defined me. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for when this journey began, but it was honest, and it was mine, and it was leading towards something new and important. And sometimes, that's the most any of us can ask, for the courage to choose love over convention, even when the cost is higher than we'd ever imagined. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.